Hi, this is Cheryl Gallant, your Conservative Member of Parliament for the beef-loving riding of Renfrew-Nipissing-Pembroke. The CBC is gaslighting Canadians. Last week, the state broadcaster published two separate articles on what's going around as the CBC Cricket Conspiracy. According to the CBC, there's a vast right-wing conspiracy stretching across international borders. The CBC says the goal of this shadowy network is to destroy democracy using memes about crickets. To call this fake news would be an insult to forgery artists. This is propaganda disguised as clickbait. The CBC is pushing a radical socialist agenda and trying to silence any dissent. For decades, the climate zealots have tried to stigmatize eating beef and normalize eating insects. From a 2011 headline in Science magazine, "To fight global warming, eat bugs." From CNN in 2015, "Does eating bugs help fight climate change?" Here's the Guardian in 2017. "Eat insects and fake meat to cut impact of livestock on the planet." Study. Even the World Economic Forum wants in on the action, writing in 2022, 5 reasons why eating insects could reduce climate change. Earlier this year, when the government announced plans to slap a warning label on ground beef, I mentioned how the government was also funding a cricket processing plant. Naturally, when the Dutch government is ordered by the European Union, the court, to slash emissions from the agricultural sector by culling herds and reducing fertilizer usage, people become concerned about where their food will come from. If you dare express that concern on social media, the CBC will label you a conspiracy theorist. The Dutch protests have attracted attention from people around the world who feel similarly disenfranchised by the global technocratic elite. Rather than give voice to marginalized people, the CBC ruthlessly enforces the Laurentian elite's viewpoint. Incredibly, in what might just be the least self-aware sentence of the year, the CBC warns about how coverage of the so-called far right might distract from real concerns over fertilizer policy. Quote, "It also threatens to overshadow legitimate concerns that Canadian farmers have about how to grow food while also addressing climate change," end quote. It's not until the very end of the article, after much discussion of the so-called far right, that the reader might learn a single detail about the government's target. Even then, the CBC engages in misinformation when it cites a recent government discussion paper. Quote, "The discussion paper also cites industry and government research that concluded significant emissions reductions can be achieved by expanding the use of certain techniques like applying fertilizer in the spring instead of the fall," end quote. What the CBC fails to mention is farmers are already applying fertilizer in the spring instead of the fall. Of the 13 techniques to reduce emissions, the one cited by the CBC as an example would be the second least effective measure in terms of reducing total reductions, and one of the methods the government does not have a high confidence in with the data to support it. I encourage Canadians interested in this to read the government discussion paper rather than relying on the CBC's reporting of the issue. The paper makes it very clear that the target of 30% by 2030 is politically driven. When CBC also fails to report is that the regional variation in nitrogen emissions from farming also occurs. While nitrogen emissions are higher per capita on farms in liberal-dominated provinces, much of the focus of the paper is on methods Western farmers could adopt. What the CBC also fails to report is the government's own admission it lacks the data and the means to even determine if the reductions are being achieved. An entire section of the discussion paper is devoted to the data challenges. Now, a reasonable person would be asked why CBC would fail to mention a significant section of the discussion paper the same week. Farmers in Saskatchewan reported Environment Canada employees trespassing on their farms to take nitrate samples. The CBC's target audience and the Liberal base do not want to hear details about regional variations in emissions or data collection challenges. They want to know the government has a simple plan, like 30% cut by 2030, to ease their guilt when flying off to their next vacation. They don't worry about the price of food or the impact of their preferred policies and what that will have on Canadians with below average incomes. They'll dismiss the opposition to their policy preferences as being based on ignorance or hate and brand their opponents as far right. The term far right was first deployed by Marxists to denounce socialists who did not support violent revolution. The socialists adopted it to denounce liberal reformers who did not support peaceful socialist revolutions. Finally, the liberal reformers adopted it to denounce liberal conservatives who did not support progressivism. Now the term is deployed to describe anyone in the liberal media decides is a threat to the interests of the elite. Prior to the pandemic, anti-vaxxers were characterized as granola-eating, Birkenstock-wearing New Age hippies. Once the pandemic arrived, the media stereotype quickly shifted to portray anti-vaxxers as far right. Now farmers concerned about federal government's arbitrary target demanding a 30% reduction in nitrogen emissions from fertilizer by 2030 are being labeled as far right. The Canadian media is so obsessed with their far right fiction, it clearly distorts news coverage. According to Google, the term far right appears 3 times as often as far left on CBC News. On CTV's news site, far right appears 10 times as often as far left. On Global News site, far right appears 20 times more often than far left. Now, for comparison, the terms far right and far left appear at similar rates on foxnews.com. Interestingly, so-called right-wing Fox News mentions Republican more than Democrat in much the same proportion as CBC mentions liberal over conservative. Now, to be clear, while there's no far right, there are dangerous, violent political ideologies which seek to impose radical changes to our pluralistic democratic constitutional order. Now, many of these groups are motivated by hate for others, including minorities and women, but also for industrialists and capitalists and colonialists. Though these groups should be confronted, denounced, and dismantled. They should not be given national platforms by the liberal media to use as smears against conservative politicians. Last week, Canadians learned how the Heritage Department gave hundreds of thousands of tax dollars to a racist bigot to teach the media how to be anti-racist. This is the same Heritage Department tasked with drafting the online censorship rules. The money came from the same fund which supports the Liberal Party AstroTurf organization, the anti-Canadian hate network. Now these radical socialists are using your tax dollars to politically interfere in school board elections. This dangerous organization is another example of how anyone who does not agree 100% with the radical socialist agenda is labeled as far right. As part of their campaign to stack school boards with socialists, they're encouraging Canadians to spy on one another for potential wrongthink. This is Soviet-style thought control, and the only path forward is to defund the CBC, these radical socialists, and end government support for legacy media. While I've been highly critical of the content of a particular CBC article and critical of the legacy media's efforts to shape elite opinion, I hold no ill will for the journalists who wrote these articles. I can't know if the author pitched the story or was handed the assignment by their editor. Journalists report to an editor. The editor reports to a news director, who reports to a vice president, who reports to a CEO, who reports to the board of directors. In the United States, the New York Times even reports to the Democratic Senate leader. The skew in coverage of terms like far right and far left are systemic structural biases of the industry. Individual journalists cannot be held responsible for the structure of the media. Recently, a number of female journalists have been targeted with death threats for their coverage of people with a range of radical political ideologies. Every Canadian has the right to work free of fear and free of harassment. Every Canadian also has the right to speak or express themselves without being subjected to threats to their life and their livelihood. It doesn't matter how much the legacy media abetted the rise of cancel culture and illiberalism. Violence and intimidation have no place in Canadian democracy. Live from Ottawa, this is Cheryl Gallant.